church mice.
That's right.
Yes.
Okay.
Very important things.
Yeah.
That's our story, we're sticking
Yeah,
to it.
right. There are elders and deacons and mice. All right, well, I'll go ahead and start us.
Is that it?
There he is, Paul Tillich, who was one of the preeminent theologians and philosophers of religion of the 20th century. He was driven out of his homeland of Germany in 1933, migrated to the United States at the age, at that time, of 47, became a U.S. citizen in 1940, and wrote his most important works in English. He even achieved celebrity status in this country in the 1950s, appearing on the cover of Time magazine in 1959. Paul Johannes Tillich was born August 20th, 1886. He was born the same date as Bultmann, but 2 years later. Yeah. So, and I was pleased to see them because they are fellow Leos. Tillich was born in Starkzettel, a small town in the province of Brandenburg. His father, Johannes, was a conservative Lutheran pastor. His mother, Matilda Terselen, was from the Rhineland and was also more liberal religiously. His father became a superintendent or bishop of the Diocese of Schönfließ-Neumark when Paul was 4. In 1900, the family moved from the small, it was very old, they still had a town wall from the Middle Ages, Schönfließ, to the family moved to Berlin. Tillich's schooling was in what were called humanistic gymnasium. Gymnasium was the college preparatory high school, the equivalent of the French lycée. And the humanistic gymnasium was one which emphasized more literature, philosophy, history, and that kind of thing. Berlin was, of course, a large city. It was the capital with a diverse population and a rich intellectual and cultural life. After secondary schooling, Tillich studied in the theological faculties of the Universities of Berlin, Tübingen, Breslau, Halle, Wittenberg. In 1911, he received a PhD in philosophy from the University of Breslau, and in 1912, the equivalent in theology from the University of Halle. So, and he always considered himself both a philosopher and a theologian. And at different periods held university appointments in one or the other field. Tillich was ordained to the ministry of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in 1912. In 1914, with the outbreak of the Great War, he volunteered as a chaplain in the Imperial German Army and served throughout the war. He spent the war on the Western Front in the trenches. He buried his closest friend and numerous soldiers in the soil of France. He was hospitalized 3 times for combat trauma and was awarded the Iron Cross for bravery under fire. After the war, Tillich became a lecturer at the University of Berlin. That was a position he held from 1919 to 1924. On his return from the war, Tillich also met Hannah Werner, and they married in 1924. It was the second marriage for both after brief previous marriages. Paul and Hannah would remain together for the rest of their lives and had 2 children, a girl and a boy. After Paul's death in 1965, Hannah wrote an extraordinary autobiography entitled From Time to Time, published in 1973. It was beautifully written, very detailed, and shockingly candid about their many years together. Hannah and Tillich's good friends always called him Paulus. P-A-U-L-U-S. From 1924 to 25, Tillich was a member of the theology faculty at the University of Marburg, and among his colleagues there were Martin Heidegger and Rudolf Bultmann, and he would be in intellectual dialogue with both of them throughout his career. Tillich went on to teach theology at Dresden University of Technology and the University of Leipzig. In 1929, he was appointed professor of philosophy and sociology at the University of Frankfurt am Main. Now, immediately after World War I, Tillich had been one of the founders of the religious socialist movement in Germany. The religious socialists were deeply influenced by Marx's critical analysis of capitalism and bourgeois society, and were active in advocating for workers' rights and fundamental economic and political change. However, he rejected economic materialism, utopianism, and all forms of purely secular and doctrinaire socialism in favor of a holistic and broadly religious view of society. There was a similar phenomenon I may have mentioned this in my first presentation, in Britain, which was very active in the 19th century and continued well into the 20th, which they called Christian socialism. And there was a very prominent clergy involved in that. Tillich wrote books and articles on religious socialism throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. His long and outspoken association with religious socialism, I'm sorry, I'm a little slow off the mark this morning. It was his religious socialism, his active support of Jews, and his anti-Nazi speeches and writings led to his name appearing on the first list of German academics to be dismissed from their positions when Hitler came to power, and at Frankfurt, the only non-Jewish faculty member. Fortunately, by then, Tillich's reputation had crossed the Atlantic. Reinhold Niebuhr had known Tillich since 1919 and admired his work. Niebuhr was in Germany during the summer of 1933, shortly after Tillich's dismissal, and it was mainly Niebuhr who persuaded a reluctant Tillich to emigrate. The dean and faculty of Union Theological Seminary in New York, at that time America's most prestigious center for theological studies, offered Tillich a position, and each of the faculty contributed 5% of his salary in order to pay Tillich's salary until it could be accommodated in the following year's budget. This was not actually a small sacrifice in the depths of the Great Depression. So Tillich and Hannah, with their children, began a new life in the United States when he was 47 years old. And as he relates it, very probably he had a real modesty about him, without even a minimal knowledge of the language. That seems too much. Tillich would remain a member of the Union Seminary faculty until he retired in 1955. During the 1930s and 40s, in addition to his teaching, substantial writing, and regular preaching, he was actively involved in refugee work with the then Federal Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches. For 15 years, Tillich also chaired Self-Help for Emigres from Central Europe, an organization that provided counsel and help to the thousands of refugees, most of them Jews, who were arriving from Europe every year. And in 1938, at a rally in Madison Square Garden, Tillich gave his first political speech in English, attacking Nazi anti-Semitism and affirming the unity of Christians and Jews. In the midst of all this, he also was naturalized as a U.S. citizen in 1940. From 1942 to 44, Tillich made 112 radio broadcasts to Germany for the Voice of America, calling upon his fellow Germans to repudiate and resist the Third Reich. Okay, now, I will remember this time. Oh, wait, okay, I'm gonna come back to this, I will, there. He lectured and wrote extensively. His favorite mode of writing was essays based on his lectures and sermons, and some of his major books are collections of essays. During the 1930s and 40s, Tillich published a series of books that explored a variety of issues at the intersection of theology, philosophy, and modern culture. In 1936, he published The Interpretation of History. The introduction was a long autobiographical sketch that he called On the Boundary, which was later published separately as a short book. Tillich wrote that, quote, "The boundary is the best place for acquiring knowledge." At the beginning of On the Boundary, he wrote that, quote, "The concept of the boundary might be the fitting symbol for the whole of my personal and intellectual development. At almost every point, I have had to stand between alternative possibilities of existence, to be completely at home in neither, and to take no definitive stand against either." And just to give you an example from his table of contents for On the Boundary: between two temperaments, between city and country, between social classes, between reality and imagination, theory and practice, theology and philosophy, church and society, religion and culture, Lutheranism and socialism, idealism and Marxism, and finally between native and alien land. And I will say, he begins that by saying, well, the boundary between native land and alien country is not merely an external boundary marked off by nature or by history. It is also the boundary between two inner forces, two possibilities of human existence. Tillich was writing many of his most influential books throughout the 1930s and 1950s. Among them were The Protestant Era, published in 1948. This was a collection of his essays, the first of he also published the first of 3 volumes of his sermons in 1948. The first volume was called The Shaking of the Foundations. And actually his sermons are a good introduction to Tillich. And they're very readable. And then he published the first of 3 volumes of his systematic theology. That was in 1951. And this, of course, the systematic theology was a comprehensive statement of his theology. 2 of Tillich's best-known works date from these years. One was The Courage to Be, published in 1952. These were his Terry lectures at Yale. And the book it's a very rich book. It's an analysis of the human situation, the meaning of courage, the nature of faith, and the question of God, drawing on his expertise in both existentialist philosophy and depth psychology. The other book that became popular was Dynamics of Faith, that he published in 1957. This was a study of the meanings of faith, containing his influential characterization of faith as ultimate concern, which pervades both religious and secular life. And I'll be coming back to that. In 1955, he published a little book entitled Biblical Religion and the Search for Ultimate Reality. Actually, I recommend that book as a good, brief introduction to his thought. I've got it here somewhere, yeah. Anyway, just to show you that it's not long. Okay. In 1959, he published a collection of essays defining and analyzing the religious dimension of various aspects of culture, with chapters on the visual arts, existentialist philosophy, psychoanalysis, science, ethics, and education. And the title of that book is Theology of Culture. He regularly gave lectures on art in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Now I'm going to actually go back. Following his retirement from Union Seminary in 1955, Tillich became a university professor at Harvard. That was from 55 to 1962, where he taught undergraduate students in large classrooms and also taught graduate student seminars. While at Harvard, Tillich published volume 2 of his systematic theology and his popular book, Dynamics of Faith, in 1957. And that was the period when he was featured on the cover of Time magazine. He really was, during his period in the United States, one of the leading public intellectuals of that era. In 1962, Tillich left Harvard to accept an endowed professorship at the University of Chicago. The third and last volume of his systematic theology was published in 1963. In 1965, while in Chicago, Tillich died on October the 22nd, 10 days after suffering a heart attack. He was 79. In 1966, his ashes were interred in a park created to honor him, the Paul Tillich Park in New Harmony, Indiana. And I haven't been there, but there's a large bust of Tillich that's prominent in the park. Okay. Well, there we go. And just a few personal reflections. I took a graduate seminar with Tillich in the spring of 1962. This was not your typical graduate seminar. Since it was Tillich, there were about 100 of us in the class. The topic was life and the spirit, which would become one of the two main topics in volume 3 of the Systematic Theology in 1963. Tillich, of course, had a graduate teaching assistant to assist him, and of course to grade the papers. But at the beginning of class, he would announce that anyone who had questions should write them down on a piece of paper, and at the mid-seminar break, put the questions on the table at the front of the room. And after the break, Tillich would go through the questions and respond to every one. Tillich always wore a suit, typically dark navy gray, and tie. But surprisingly, I don't think you'll find this in any biographies of Tillich. He always wore white socks. Don't ask me why. I don't know why he wore white socks all the time, but he did. I also sat in on a session of one of his undergraduate courses, and students filled all the desks and were sitting on the floor. He was immensely popular. Years later, when I was teaching, I acquired a cassette tape of an interview with Tillich that I sometimes used in class. It was made in 1955, and I don't bring it or use it because I don't know how to play cassette tapes anymore. He had recently retired from Union Seminary and was now at Harvard when he was interviewed. But he had returned to Union to give a lecture. And his interviewer is one of his graduate students. It's a fascinating recording, I wish I could play, including some reminiscences of his childhood in the medieval town of Schoenflies, where the boys would like to go up on the town wall and run around up there. And the one that really got me was his reminiscing about how he would lie in bed at night at the age of 9, pondering the question of the infinite. I don't think I was quite there when I was coming up. Tillich had a low, pleasant voice, very German accented. He always spoke of theology. Now, Germans have the TH combination, but it's all pronounced T. They don't have either the soft or the hard or the sound, so theology. In the spring of 1963, a seminar class made up of students at UC Santa Barbara met to discuss Tillich's thought with Tillich himself. All the students had prepared by reading extensively in Tillich's writings. Each session, this was both senior undergraduate students and graduate students. Each session was tape recorded and later edited for publication by the seminar's instructor, Mackenzie Brown, who got help from the students in the class, including one student who wrote a preface including a brief biography of Tillich. And before it went to press, it was reviewed for accuracy by Tillich. The book that resulted is entitled Ultimate Concern, Tillich in Dialogue, was published in 1965. And the diversity and wide range of topics and issues they discuss are mind-boggling. And what did I do with it? There it is. I just want to read a brief passage from it to give you an idea of Tillich. Tillich had worked in a seminar, a real seminar type setting with not very many students. During the weeks, this was written by a student in the seminar. During the weeks of the seminar, which this book presents, one quality in Paul Tillich's teaching was especially evident. He maintained throughout the attitude of a fellow searcher after truth, never that of the pedagogue. It was as though each student had some unique experience or insight which Dr. Tillich considered vital to know. He was never so pleased as when he was contradicted and a new viewpoint or an unfamiliar fact was presented to him. Needless to say, instances of successful contradiction were rare indeed. A bit about his thought. And I've put this under 4 headings: faith and religion, symbol and myth, the method of correlation, and God. In his book, The Protestant Era, Tillich tells of how what he called the Protestant principle of justification by faith became the key to his own book. And I decided I would put excerpts from his writings talking about his thought on paper so that I would not ramble on more than I should. So I have a longish section on how he expanded the idea of justification by faith. So he says the principle of justification through faith refers not only to the religious ethical, but also to the religious intellectual life. Not only he who is in sin, but also he who is in doubt is justified through faith. The situation of doubt, even of doubt about God, need not separate us from God. There is faith in every serious doubt, namely the faith in the truth as such, even if the only truth we can express is our lack of truth. And I'm reminded of Alfred Lord Tennyson in Memoriam, the great lines, there lives more faith in honest doubt, believe me, than in half our creeds. But if this is experienced, if this doubt is experienced in its depth and as an ultimate concern, the divine is present. And he who doubts in such an attitude is justified in his thinking. He who seriously denies God affirms him. There is no place beside the divine. There is no possible atheism. There is no wall between the religious and the non-religious. Being religious is being unconditionally concerned, whether this concern expresses itself in secular or, in the narrower sense, religious form. Neither works of piety, nor works of morality, nor works of the intellect establish unity with God. They follow from this unity, but they do not make it. This unconditional seriousness is the expression of the divine in the experience of utter separation from it. It is this radical and universal interpretation of the doctrine of justification through faith which has made me a conscious Protestant. And then that moves us directly to his definition of faith as ultimate concern, which he does in Dynamics of Faith. And I have a shorter quote there. Man, like every living being, is concerned about many things, but man, in contrast to other living beings, has spiritual concerns, cognitive, aesthetic, social, political. If a concern claims ultimacy, it demands the total surrender of him who accepts this claim, and it promises total fulfillment, even if all other claims have to be subjected to it or rejected in its name. And he goes on to give examples of ultimate concern: extreme nationalism. This was not too long after everybody had lived through the fascist and Nazi period. The universality of the God of the biblical faith, success, social standing, economic power. So clearly, with Tillich, we're breathing completely different theological air from Barton and Bonhoeffer on the subject of religion. We've traveled from their negative interpretation of religion and Bonhoeffer's idea that we're living in an increasingly religion-less world, to Tillich's view that faith permeates all of human life, even in the modern world. But of course, everything hangs on how faith and religion are defined. Barton and Bonhoeffer understood by religion what we usually think of when we use the term: people organized into identifiable communities, special rituals, sacred books, teachings, rules, all in the service of a commitment to a way of life centered on what the communities believe to be ultimate, transcendent realities. Barth saw religion in this usual narrower sense as inherently idolatrous because of our fallen condition. For Barth, both the non-Christian and the Christian are per se, in ourselves, godless human beings. Religion, our loftiest human efforts to aspire beyond ourselves, are the human institutions that are the most susceptible to the idolatry of the self, including Christianity. For Tillich, this is a narrow and flawed understanding of religion. His approach is what we might call analytical and functional. What are religious expressions of faith understood as human dispositions and activities? Is it possible that faith so understood can also be found in other aspects of human culture besides religion? With his definition of faith as ultimate concern, Tillich is looking at religion descriptively and positively as basic to human culture. In this regard, he's harking back to Friedrich Schleiermacher, the father of liberal theology. This does not mean that Tillich does not accept the Christian doctrine of universal sinfulness. Ultimate concerns can often be idolatrous and destructive, but his treatment of it is very different from Barth's and Bonhoeffer's, who understand religion and sin entirely from what they consider a biblical and confessional perspective. And then he, did I include this? Oh, okay, on symbol and myth. In his book, Dynamics of Faith, Tillich distinguished between signs and symbols. Both, he said, point beyond themselves to something else. But signs are arbitrary and functional conventions like stop signs, traffic lights. Symbols, by contrast, are bound up with what they point to in an existential, participatory way. And they open up aspects of the self and the world that are otherwise inaccessible. Examples would be the American flag or the Christian cross. Tillich defined myths, now we're getting back to Bultmann territory again, as, quote, symbols of faith combined in stories about divine human encounters, unquote. He maintained that what he called, along with Bultmann, demythologization was essential to reflective faith, but that this means not the elimination of myth, but, quote, the necessity of recognizing a symbol as a symbol and a myth as a myth. Very importantly, Tillich distinguished between the unbroken and the broken myth. The unbroken myth is a natural literalism, which characterizes what he calls the primitive period, by which he simply means the original period, the early period, of both individuals and groups, in which the mythical and the literal are indistinguishable. When critical questions and challenges arise, the natural literalist may respond with a reactive literalism, suppressing the questions and continuing to affirm the unbroken myth in the face of critical inquiry. By contrast, the way of mature, reflective faith is to recognize the broken or symbolic character of all myths and to embrace a non-literal appropriation of the myths one had earlier believed literally. As Tillich remarks with emphasis, faith, if it takes its symbols literally, becomes idolatrous. Okay, then I'm cruising along here. Try to finish this up very shortly. Tillich approached theology in terms of what he called the method of correlation, a question and answer approach. And I've quoted a little bit from the first volume of his Systematic Theology. The method of correlation explains the contents of the Christian faith through existential questions and theological answers in mutual interdependence. Systematic theology makes an analysis of the human situation out of which the existential questions arise, and demonstrates that the symbols used in the Christian message are the answers to these questions. And he says the analysis is done in terms which today are called existential. He means the analysis of lived human existence, such as the existentialists like Heidegger and Sartre and those people were doing. And so that's the way he structures his systematic theology. And he has 5 theological topics, starting with reason and revelation. So humans through reason raise kinds of questions. You know, why are we here? Where are we all going? And what does it mean for us to be in the world? And the theological response is the idea of revelation, that there is, in addition, we participate in revelation of God. And then the second topic, these both appear in the first volume, are being and God. We ask the question of being. What does it mean to be Hamlet, to be or not to be? And the theological answer is God, which is being itself. As he says, the ground and power of being in everything that has being. And then the next volume is existence of the Christ, human human beings are, our way of being, Tillich calls existence, which is a mixture of being and non-being. Our being involves non-being because we are finite. We are limited. Only being itself is unlimited, infinite. And so, so our existence is, and interestingly, he uses the term existence only to refer to human being. And so that can cause a little problem. And anyway, the theological response to the question of our very mixed existence is the Christ, Jesus as the Christ, which Tillich interprets as the bearer of what he calls the new being. And then life and the Spirit. See, we've covered the Trinity here. Life and the Spirit is the situation of human life is this going on from this mixture of being and non-being that he calls existence. And then the Spirit is the divine as it operates within our lives. And then finally he deals with history, because that's always been a fundamental human question. What is history all about? Is it just the meaningless rise and fall of nations and empires and this kind of thing? And so the question of the meaning of history finds its theological answer in the kingdom of God. And that is the last topic that I want to mention was God, which Tillich defines philosophically as being itself, or the ground and power of being in everything that has being. And here in this quotation I have, the being of God cannot be understood as the existence of a being alongside others or above others. If God is a being, he is subject to the categories of finitude. Whenever infinite or unconditional power and meaning are attributed to the highest being, it has ceased to be a being and has become being itself. And this points to the power inherent in everything, the power of resisting non-being. And nothing else, he says, can be said about God as God, which is not symbolic. Except for God as being itself, everything we say about God is symbolic in Tillich's sense. Okay, I will stop there. I have really taken up plenty of time with that, and probably some of this is head breaking, what the French call casse-tête, head breaker. But what kinds of issues or questions? Yeah.
Did he think of being as being in inanimate objects as well as in human beings?
No, it is.
If the being
the
is
power of being is the power that is involved in the being of inanimate objects as well as animals, vegetables.
So he did think of being as being in all creation then.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That's like Gandhi.
Yeah. Gandhi had there are aspects of Hinduism that are similar.
And then what about his ideas on justification by faith? What does he think of that? And the traditional Christian justification by faith, and his concept of faith is.
Well, I just talked about.
I know I didn't get it.
For Tillich, it was the application of justification through faith to the realm of intellectual issues, doubting.
Yeah, but you see, that's
This is
different than the
justification.
traditional Christian, I mean, the conservative Christian concept of justification by faith, isn't it?
No, it's not. It's really an enlargement of the view. I mean, the traditional idea of justification is we are justified even though we are sinful. That is, we are accepted by God even though we're sinful. And he's expanding this. He's saying, yes, that,
Yes.
but also doubting.
Yeah, but that, we wouldn't, a fundamental Christian wouldn't include doubt, I don't think.
No,
Okay,
wouldn't
right.
it?
But
No.
he does, of course, yeah.
He does, yeah.
Yeah.
No, the fundamentalist would say, would appeal to certainty.
Yes,
Doubt.
yes.
Rather than.
This is just fascinating, Jim. And my question, I'm not trying to sound confrontational, but we say, he who seriously denies God affirms him. Now, that's Tillich looking at it from a Christian standpoint. What would a true atheist say to that?
Well, Tillich didn't actually believe that there were any true atheists. There were people who thought there were. But yeah, somebody who takes an atheistic view of reality is going to object to it. Say, no, it's not.
Because I mean, in a way, I've always had doubts about atheism myself. I mean, it just seems to me that people are ignoring what seems to me to be the reality of God. Yet I had a friend whose father was an Auschwitz survivor. And walked around with a tattoo on his arm the rest of his life. I didn't know his father well, but he said, "Oh, my father just decided after that experience there could not possibly be a supreme being."
Yeah, he did have that.
And although I'm not atheist myself, that always made sense to me. If you've been through such a horrible experience as that,
Yeah.
you might just decide, how can there be a supreme being watching out for me if I experience this?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, it gave me more respect for atheism than I had before that.
But that's also the definition of a supreme being. Maybe a supreme being is not looking out after us, you know.
No. I've always felt that the rational position in this was agnosticism. I don't know. Whereas the atheist is actually affirming something. There is no God.
Yeah, good distinction.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jim, would Paul's question have implications about, would Paul's question and the answer about supreme being, would that take us onto a path of eliminating all the omnis that we live by, that most people live by with regard to faith? Omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent. That takes us away to get rid of those, because those are signs as opposed to symbols with regard to supreme being.
Yeah. Tillich tackles the problems of asserting omniscience, omnipotence, and so forth about God, and I honestly don't remember how he deals with those. Those would be symbolic ways of talking about God as well. Actually, not everybody who's a theist, specifically a Christian, believes that God is omnipotent, for example. You have the idea of God as finite, as constrained by things that God did not, that God is not responsible for. And yeah, you certainly have people who have criticized the view of making God omnipotent, because that's the main problem you get into. If God is omnipotent, omniscient, and all-loving, how do you account for the evil
you said that Tillich would see those as symbols. And what I see happening theologically is not so much as symbols, but as signs.
Well, signs would be arbitrary, conventional sorts of ways of, sidewalks closed, and,
Okay.
that kind of thing.
I have to go to choir, so I can't.
No, you do.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I just kind of a personal experience. When I was either second semester freshman or first semester sophomore, I read his sermon, "You Are Accepted."
Uh-huh.
Changed my life. It was
That
like,
was-
he was
yeah.
writing to me. And it's like, I don't know now, I look back at it now and it's like, well, that's interesting, but then it was so important because, think, you are accepted, but the problem is accepting the acceptance. And the paradox somehow or another just struck me.
Yeah.
It had to do not with the rational thing, it had to do with the experience, the existential experience.
Uh-huh.
So it was just profound at that time.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's amazing.
That was a sermon that really
Yes.
affected people. Yeah. Yeah. Was that in the first volume?
I don't know which one of those.
Yeah, but, yeah, that's an important sermon. Yeah.
First of all, I really appreciate all the work you put in this class. It's been fascinating. Is there one thing that all four of these gentlemen can agree on?
Well, I'm not sure.
It's complicated.
Yeah, it's as they say, it's complicated. Bart and Bonhoeffer were reasonably close together. But Bultmann and Tillich, they really reclaimed aspects of the liberal Protestant tradition. And, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, Bultmann would have agreed. I mean, Bultmann was essentially always talking about God of the Bible. He was talking about biblical issues. And so he would have had that in common, Bart and Bonhoeffer, even though he would not have interpreted things the way they did. But Tillich, yeah. No, I learned a lot from Tillich over the years, but I finally simply could not make sense altogether of the idea of God as being
As God is what?
as being itself, as the grounded power of being and everything that is me. It does not. I can't get any purchase on it. When Thomas Aquinas said that God was being itself, I know I have an idea of what he really meant by that, and that was graspable. But I just always found Tillich's idea very elusive, and so, and unfortunately, that's the foundation of the whole thing for Tillich.
But if you were to try to describe God, that is to limit God. So to me, the concept of God as being, without any description, is more accurate.
Well, that's a good point.
I agree.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. To me, it just, it, among other things, it depersonalizes.
It does. But God is so much more than what we can possibly comprehend.
Yeah.
Therefore, the symbols give you a point, but they don't describe. And when you
Yeah.
want to make God personal, you are making God like you, and God is not, that's not God. I think his concept of being is really a good way to describe God. You can't describe it.
And we can understand.
That's very well done.
I think that's
yeah,
true, yeah.
Very well said. And,
It takes away the personal relationship in a way, but you can get that through Jesus, who was
yeah,
the Son of God,
yeah,
but you can't get it from the concept of being.
right. But of course, Boltman said all of our talk about God has to be analogical. We take terms from our experience and apply them to God.
Mhm.
Like God as a father or a mother.
And we make God into what we want God to be.
Well, we do that too, yeah. But pretty much all of our talk about God is of this character.
Well, it gets even confusing because I know that, but Borg does this. See, people say, well, what about Jesus? Is God immanent in Jesus? He says, not necessarily, but Jesus points to God.
Mm-hmm.
He's a living symbol
Mm-hmm.
that points to being. And so you have to wrestle with what that means.
Yeah, that would be very Tillich, very much like
Yeah,
Tillich's
yeah.
idea of the Christ, as he goes. Yeah. So, yeah. But his thought is really very rich, and that's also what the theologians call dialectical, as you can see in his saying the person who denies God is also affirming God, because they're acknowledging truth, and so there are lots of paradoxes and dialectical moves in Tillich. Anyway, what else? That's a great point. Related in a way to what you were saying was that when God reveals God's name to Moses, he says, I am that I am, or I will be that I will be. It's a version of the Hebrew verb for to be. And I've always thought that's kind of neat. That transcends gender, anything like that, and simply says God is the one who is. Yeah.
I've always liked that definition. It's equal on each part. I am who I am. There's
Yeah,
no description.
I am who I am.
Yeah.
So, and that's Yahweh. That's the word Yahweh, which of course became considered so sacred in the Israelite and in the Jewish tradition that it's no longer pronounced. You substitute the word Adonai, which is a generic word for Lord, for Yahweh. Anyway.
This is a more personal note to ask you. Being raised in the Episcopal tradition, was there any push and shove as far as Tillich or any of these theologians?
Actually, I was mixed, religiously mixed. I grew up in both the Methodist and the Episcopal Church, not at the same time.
Well, you just became a high Methodist and became Episcopal.
No, there was no problem at all.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's where I encountered all these guys.
Yeah.